Here we go. All right. Hello, everyone. I'm Keith DeStone. I'd like to welcome you to the Cosmos Society Online House Series, a production of the Harvard University Center for Hellenic Studies. The series is meant to bring our broader CHS community into contact with current active researchers. Our guest today is Dr. Chiara Palladino. She is an assistant professor of classics at Furman University, and her primary interest is in ancient mapping and spatial narratives of the pre-modern world. She works, as she herself has described it, in the weird niche between classical philology and computer science, also known as digital humanities, with the goal of taking meaningful information from Greek and Latin geographical texts and also of evaluating these texts in light of modern mapping and modeling strategies. The topic of our conversation today is, not surprisingly, discovering ancient documents with digital mapping tools. I'd like to point out to those watching the live stream or the archived recording that today's open house has a practical hands-on element, and to follow along when we're doing that here in the Zoom, you can check the link in the description of the video, which will send you to the Cosmos website where you can find instructions to do this activity yourself in the meantime. And then we'll come back and have more kind of debriefing of that experience at the end. Yeah, so that said, Chiara, welcome to Cosmos. Thank you for accepting the invitation to tell us about these tools, this cutting edge approach. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much, Keith. So welcome, everyone. As Keith announced, this is going to be kind of a different sort of seminar from what you may be used from before. So I'm just going to give you an introduction. I prepared some slides, which I'm going to share in a second, and then we're going to do some actual work. We're going to get to play with texts and tools and maybe produce a couple of cute maps. So I'm just going to share my presentation right now. And by the way, if anybody has any questions at any point, please feel free to like raise your hands and interrupt me or anything. Or if you at some point cannot see anything or you cannot hear anything, just let me know and we're gonna figure it out. Okay, so let's start. And can everybody see the slides?
Mm-hmm. Perfect.
Excellent. So all right, so we're just going to start with a couple of things. As I said, kind of an unusual format for this particular seminar. I want to give you a general introduction, which is going to be inevitably, superficial, and we're not going to cover all of it because that would take hours, if not days. But I just want to cover a couple of the key concepts and terminology that we're going to use repeatedly during the work. And so I just want to make sure that everybody is confident and comfortable with those terms, which look terrifying. You will realize that they're absolutely not anything particularly complex. And then I'm going to show you a couple of possible, advanced applications that you can have fun with at some point with your, with your texts and with the annotations that you may produce. And then we're going to do the hands-on work with Recogito. Eventually, at the end, like 10 minutes before the end, we're going to reconvene and we're going to have a final discussion with questions and comments. So this seminar is about, mapping and space, right? And places and all that kind of stuff. So what is the most important resource to study places? Like when you want to study space in the ancient world, what do you do? Where do you go? What kind of book do you reach for?
Feel free to speak out if you have an answer to this.
Travel.
I would look at online maps. Google Maps sometimes has good information.
Okay.
Atlas.
What else?
The
Pausanias.
So
the one with ancient names on it.
Okay. Okay, a bunch of all of that, actually. So if you want to look about, if you want to talk about space in a sort of a general term, or if you just want to have, travel information, probably websites are a good place to start. If you want to know about ancient space more in general, probably what you do is you look at an atlas, and I'm going to introduce you one in a second. Sometimes you just want to read something. So a text that has some sort of spatial information in it, and somebody mentioned Pausanias, you can read some of the texts that we are actually going to read today. You can read Herodotus, you can read a bunch of things, right? And that is precisely where we're going to start from. So I don't know how many of you know this, but there is actually one important modern atlas, specifically tied to the Greek and Roman world, which is called conventionally the Barrington Atlas. The Barrington Atlas is a very, very large project. It began at the end of the 80s. It was published in the 2000s, and it is sort of the main reference for the study of ancient space and ancient places in print. And that's an important distinguishing element. It was published with a lot of updated maps, accompanying information, periodization from the archaic period to late antiquity, alternative names, coordinates, of course, a lot of maps, a lot of modern maps, both in small scale and large scale, and so on and so forth. Now, the problem is that it's in print, right? And we're talking about digital resources. So we have to step a little bit aside from our conventional idea of atlases and get familiar with a more specific term, which is gazetteer, or rather online gazetteer, which is what we're talking about. A gazetteer in digital humanities and digital mapping in particular is basically the equivalent of an atlas, but digitized in digital format, in machine actionable format. And the most important one, if you want to study the ancient world and specifically the Greco-Roman world today, is Pleiades, which is the one that you see right here. There's a link that I'm going to provide in a second. Pleiades is currently the most important and the most massive gazetteer of the ancient world, although it's definitely not the only one. And there's a relationship between Pleiades and the Barrington Atlas, because Pleiades was essentially created from a digitization of the bulk of the data that was in the Barrington Atlas originally. It was taken from the print, translated into a digital format, and it was made open source for community, basically. But it has expanded considerably from the Barrington Atlas. Currently, it includes way more places, way more information. And the way that it expanded is very interesting to me because it is a community-built gazetteer. That means that basically anybody can access the database, modify entries, or enter new ones. Then, of course, you get through an editorial controlling process. But through that very simple element of participation, Pleiades was able to expand into a considerably massive gazetteer. And it also kind of led to a new way of defining the idea of an ancient place in digital humanities, because computer science and digital things are very quantitative. So when you think about place in the digital world, what comes to mind is something numerical, right? The coordinates, latitude and longitude. But we all know very well that ancient places are a little bit more complex than that. Ancient places, maybe you don't know the exact coordinates of them. Maybe they changed the location. Maybe they're mythical, but that doesn't make them less places, right? So there is a complexity in there that Pleiades addressed, and it helped us conceive, the idea of place as more than just coordinates, but as an association of information, of data, which includes a variety of things, alternative names, chronology, connections with other things, bibliographical references, archaeological findings, a lot of things that define a place just in a different way than, numbers. The other thing that I want to point out is the current technological standard that Pleiades uses, which is kind of a complex concept, but I want you to be familiar with the basics of it. The backbone of Pleiades is an identifier that is called URI. There's an acronym, of course. The URI is basically a way to unambiguously talk about an ancient place in a digital space. A URI is not very scary. It's basically just a numerical string. It is one univocal a numerical string that is attached to an individual place, one entity in a gazetteer. What a URI is meant to solve, basically, is the problem that, as you probably know, many places have the same name, right? If you look for Alexandria, you're going to find a million Alexandrias. How do you know which one is the right one? And most importantly, how does a computer know which one is the right one? Because a computer is stupid. So like, let's get that out of the way. A computer is stupid. There's no reason to be intimidated by it. So for that reason, a URI enables us to specifically talk about the place that we want to talk about. And you can actually see what a URI looks like in this slide, in the image on the left of the slide. You can see that each Alexandria is connected to a different numerical string. That is the identifier that is attached to them, and it is unique and stable. I'm sort of simplifying here, but basically that is what it is. So the identifier allows me as a researcher to identify which place I'm looking for and refer to it unambiguously in a digital space. And actually, this is the link of Pleiades with this number, which is the identifier of one specific Alexandria, which is the Egyptian Alexandria. So this is a concept that is quite important for us to understand. A URI is a unique identifier that refers unambiguously to a place, to one specific entity within a gazetteer and within our general knowledge. Let's come to the next question. Here's a little bit of Thucydides, one of my favorite ancient Greek authors. This is the beginning of the history of the Peloponnesian War. What kind of spatial information is in this text? And what kind of information is it? Like, how is it expressed?
It's expressed as text.
Mm-hmm. What kind of text? Like, if you were to give me like an indicator, where is spatial information here?
The narrative.
The place names are capitalized.
Capitalized place names. What else?
Sort of a chronological order.
Mm-hmm. There's a sequence, right? And there is also chronological information that may be important, right? Because sometimes, chronological information anchors a place to a certain period of time. We cannot, with ancient places, we cannot have the guarantee that, those same characteristics are going to be stable through time. What else? Is it just capitalized names?
Capitalized place names as well.
Mm-hmm. What else?
People. Capitalized people.
Absolutely. What else?
They're related.
Sorry, go.
No, I was just going to say their interrelationship, like the Diampora son of Anatorides.
Absolutely. What else?
And similarly with some of the towns, Platea, a town of Boeotia.
Right. There's also the information of town, right? That's the typology of a place type. What else?
Something that I see that there's not is other geographical indications. Like if you don't know where these place names are, like it doesn't say they went east and entered so-and-so.
Yes, that is very good. So there's the other thing. This is a text. It only gives me information to a certain extent, but I may have more questions, right? Like, where is Athens? Which Athens are we talking about? And again, remember, we may know, but the computer is stupid. So in digital humanities, the detection and extraction of exactly the kinds of things that you talked about has a very scary name. It's called named entity recognition and named entity classification. I'm going to tell you what it is in theory, and then I'm going to tell you how it works in practice. So these are actually two interrelated operations: named entity recognition, in short, NER, named entity classification, which is sort of what follows, what comes next. And they can be performed in two ways. They can be performed by hand, which is actually what we're going to do. But there are also, of course, programmatical way of doing it. So you create your own script, which identifies and resolves strings in a text. What do you do? Like, what is it about? Basically, named entity recognition is about recognizing and marking in some way things that are recognized, strings that are recognized as belonging to a particular category of entity. So people are an entity, right? And this is regardless of whether they appear as in capitalized form or not. Because, you know, a person or a pronoun, like I talk to Sarah and she says to me, right? She is an entity and it refers to Sarah, right? So it, regardless of whether they're capitalized or not. Places, of course, as we talked about, there is a specific type of entity that is kind of interesting for our purposes, which is events. The Battle of Plataea is an event. It's very recognizable as a string. It identifies something very specific. Dates and times are, as we discussed, sometimes titles of works, like the history of the Peloponnesian War. Citations is considered to be a specific type of entity. That's kind of a long discussion that we're not going to talk about here. And basically what you do is just, you know, try to identify them as either proper nouns or common nouns. And then there is a next stage, which is the classification stage, that allows you to disambiguate them, right? Again, what we talked about with Alexandria, it is not sufficient to know that Alexandria is a place or an entity. You have to know which Alexandria that is. Why do we do that? I mean, I think that you probably can understand it, right? Because we need context, primarily. We need to know what is what. But it's also because they enrich our representation of text in the digital space, because it's very different than having, you know, a plain text that doesn't really tell you much. They also enable us to mine the text, to extract that information and represent it in some kind of other way, right? Maps, for example. They help us to detect relationships across different kinds of entities or the same type of entity, and so on and so forth. So they set up a context, basically, for us, and they enable us to extract new information. So how do you do that? Like, how do you do name identity recognition and classification? Like in a text like this? How would you do that?
You would parse the text.
What does it mean?
That means you take every token, which could be a letter, space, punctuation mark, and try to form what would be either a word or a string. And then you form them into phrases and sentences and try to take out the information that you think would be valuable, like Ilbea, 14 years, Argos, etc.
Yes, in other words,
which would take about at least 2 or 3 times the parsing through, because you're bound to go back and revise and all that.
In other words, you start reading and you go like, okay, bunch of places, bunch of people, other things, right? Spatial entities that are not capitalized, but that we know are spatial, like the gates, for example, or people that are not capitalized, but we know are people, right? So those who had invited them in, the herald, the soldiers, the enemies, and things like that. But as we said before, this is not enough, because this is just a marked text right now. We have a bunch of entities distinguished according to colors, and that's about it, right? But we may want to know more. We may want to know where Athens is, who Pythagoras is, right? How do we do that? Now, in print, this is kind of difficult to do, like on a book. So you have to search for every single thing in another book, presumably, you know, an atlas or a dictionary or something. And you would have to do that for every single entity, and you wouldn't really have a way to put them all together. In the digital space, you can do this in a kind of a different way. Enter my favorite digital scholarly task, annotation. What is annotation? And this is, I promise, the very last piece of terminology that we need to familiarize ourselves with. What is annotation?
Additional information.
Basically, yes. It is a way of marking up a document, like a text, a map, an image, or whatever, recognizing what is interesting about it. So that thing gets highlighted, precisely how we did that before, and associating it with additional information. The annotation is the link between that thing in the document and some kind of repository of information about that thing. Sometimes when we talk about this and it is restricted to geographical information, we call it geotagging. So geotagging is basically the operation of tagging spatial entities across a text. And more specifically, when we talk about linking an entity in a document with additional information about it, we call it semantic annotation. But these are just, more refined ways of talking about the same thing. If we talk about annotation, everybody knows what we're talking about. And again, this is another operation that can be done manually or programmatically. We're going to do it manually for a bunch of different reasons, honestly. The most important one is that annotation is actually a very, very scholarly, very philological process. And I'm going to tell you why in a second. So basically, what you're doing here is to say, there's Athens in a document, and I'm going to establish a connection between the Athens in my document and an entry about that same Athens in a canonical authoritative reference, namely a gazetteer. So what am I using to, this is kind of a difficult question. How does that link work? Like, what am I using to refer specifically to that Athens in that gazetteer?
The URI.
The URI, yes, excellent. So that is exactly what you're doing. You're adding a URI to that place, in this case, in that document. So basically, you're here, you're recognizing Athens, you're attaching the little number to it. And what you're saying is, this is Athens, like that particular Athens in Attica, in Greece, in Europe. But that's not it. That's not only what you're doing. What you're doing is you're associating that string in the text to a bunch of other information that all of a sudden becomes available to you through the magic of that URI. So you get primarily all of the information that is already available in the gazetteer. So for example, in this particular case, the coordinates of that place, other references about textual evidence, bibliography, alternative names, periodization, connections with other places, the place type of that particular element. And then by transition, you can also access other things like coins that were found in that particular place, or archaeological findings, cultural heritage sites, and so on and so forth. As I said, annotation is my favorite scholarly process in the digital space, even though it's not very fancy. Like, it's really, really just about profoundly engaging with the text and trying to find as much information as possible about it. But it is great because it is sort of a extremely scholarly way of adding information to a text and making it available to other people. Encouraging an exchange of information between different digital resources, which makes it, of course, much more shareable and much more reusable to other human beings. But it also adds information to available resources because, of course, you have concretely added something to a gazetteer like Pleiades by matching it with your document. And also, as you will see in the second part of the workshop, it is much more difficult than what it seems like, a lot more difficult, because it gives you the opportunity to establish what is what in a text. And sometimes that is not so easy. It gives you the opportunity to discuss, like, what are the things that are really relevant in that text? And what do I want to do with them? How am I going to annotate them? What kind of additional information can I give to the text so that it is meaningful for me? And so on and so forth. We're going to look into this a little bit more. So what are we doing today? We're using a particular general annotation tool, which is called Recogito, to do specifically that, to annotate a bunch of spatial references, even people and events if you want, from a bunch of ancient texts. Just a couple of things about Recogito. I will give people a sort of personalized demo when we're going to work with it. But as you probably know, if you've watched the videos at this point, Recogito is this easy annotation environment that enables you to categorize and geotag or semantically annotate various things in a document. So you can do that with places, and you can assign particular URIs to them. You can do that with people. You can do that with events. Actually, there is no limit to the fantasy. You can do whatever you want, basically, provided that you have a reason to do it. And you can, of course, annotate not only text, but any kind of document, including scanned images, inscriptions if you want. We don't have inscriptions, but you may do that as well, and so on and so forth. And once you've done that, you actually get to have fun with it. The first thing that we're going to see after you will have georeferenced a bunch of places is that you're going to be able to see a map of everything that you have done. And that is sort of the magic of the gazetteer. You can also have a look into, some kind of statistical information. If you've used semantic tags, if you've used, collaborative annotation, you can see who has performed the most annotations, who has done what. You can also have a breakdown directly in Recogito of the places that you were able to disambiguate and the places that were kind of unsolved, that you couldn't identify, and so on and so forth. We're going to look into that in a second. Just a couple of things about what you can do afterwards, which we're not going to do, but just to give you a sense of where we go from here. What a lot of people do at that point is they just export all of the data that they put together with Recogito, and they upload it into, some kind of GIS software. QGIS is the most common one. But you can use a bunch of others. I have provided some links at the end of this presentation, and you can just play around with various visualizations of the places that you have mapped. What other people like to do is to visualize connections. This is kind of a very complex type of thing. And one of the things that typically happens is that, places are too many. So you gotta figure out how to make the network work for you, because a picture like this doesn't really tell you much. So there are projects out there that, sort of simplify that to the level of a research question and represent available information about itineraries. This is, for example, a networked representation of actually one of the things that we're going to do, the tabula poitingheriana. And on the left, you can actually see a project by the University of Virginia about the catalog of ships, which aims at visualizing the various networks of places in the catalog of ships. And you can do, there's no limit, really. A student of mine annotated the whole Odyssey in Greek, and we exchanged those annotations and that information with an existing digital reading environment, which is called the Scaife from Beyond Translation. I have provided some links here, and you can explore it as much as you like. There is another project about mapping Pausanias. Somebody mentioned Pausanias, so here it is. People are mapping Pausanias on Recogito, actually, and they're using the additional information from gazetteers to link those annotations with, other types of interesting things like cultural heritage sites, information about artifacts, and so on and so forth. So I have provided a bunch of things with links, with resources that you may want to explore at some point. I'm going to share the slides after the seminar so that you have sort of an idea of what is there. Really, this is by no means exhaustive, but these are some of the most important resources that you may want to explore. And I've also provided a couple of links for, advanced sort of visualizations for those of you who feel a little bit more confident with doing the work. And some bibliography if you just like to read. I love to read. I don't have enough time to do it. So everything that has been, not everything, like a bunch of things that have been published recently about specifically the workflow with digital mapping and digital annotation of spatial sources. These are mostly limited to the Greco-Roman world, but I can of course provide more general resources if you're interested. And now it's the time. Thank you very much. I'm going to take questions. And in the next half an hour or 20 minutes, we're going to map together a bunch of things. So if people are following from the YouTube stream or wherever you're following from, this is what we're going to do. So the participants have been given access to a few documents. If you are logged into Recogito, you can already find them under the little shared with me menu. I'm going to guide you step by step through it. And I have provided a choice between a couple of things. We have a map, the famous Tabula Peutingeriana. We have an itinerary from the Roman times, the Antonine itinerary, both in Latin and in an English translation. So feel free to just annotate whatever you feel comfortable with. And we have an ancient Greek work, the Catalogue of Ships, both in the original. Of course, this is the famous insert. I think it's not controversial to call it an insert in book 2 of the Iliad. This is, of course, both in ancient Greek and in English. And I was also able to find Bindor's Latin translation if you want to have fun with it. So there is plenty of things for everybody. But if you have a text that you would like to annotate, you can absolutely feel free to take that text, upload it on Recogito, and have fun with it. There is absolutely no limit at this point. So with no further ado, I'm going to take questions here about people's ideas, and then I'm going to split everybody into groups and we're going to get started.
Let's see. So any questions here at the moment? Bill.
Hey, this is really mind-boggling. I didn't notice roads on any of the maps. Are they annotated or drawn on the maps or anything?
So there's an easy answer to that and the complicated answer. The easy answer is that yes, roads from certain periods of time have been mapped and are digitally available in various formats in various resources. The complicated answer is that roads are a different kind of geographical format. A place is a point. It is considered to be a point. It's something that you can map with easily on a grid. A road is a line, right? So it is an ensemble of points. It is a little bit more complicated to map, and it is, in GIS, it is understood as a different kind of geographical format. So you do not easily find it when you look for that particular resource. What we do is generally we have an entirely different layer with line-shaped features that we can use to, understand better the function of roads and how they map onto our texts. So that is kind of a more sort of intermediate sort of step. But there are available digital resources that have that kind of information, and you can definitely use it as an additional layer to your document.
That wouldn't, roads would indicate a direction, like in a vector, velocity, and all those things as well.
That is yet another thing.
Okay.
Yeah.
We'll leave it at that because that's a deep end.
Yes. I've actually provided a link to a project at the University of Stanford, which is called Orbis, that some of you may be familiar with, that maps specifically. Actually, they don't map, they model ways of travel in the ancient world, in the ancient Roman world, limited to a couple centuries, depending on how the different external circumstances vary. So depending on the means of transportation, depending on the weather, depending on the velocity, depending on who's traveling, whether it's in the military or not, civilian, and so on. So there is a variety of contingencies in there that need to be accounted for if you want to do something that is more complex. And that gets into the field of modeling rather than in the field of performing static maps. I think Orgo has
Yes.
her hand raised. Yes.
Yes, I actually have two questions. The first is, can you do you in Recogito, can you do a search? Say you're interested in ancient temples or temples to Athena or something. Is that a possibility? And the second question is, can you embed Recogito, interactive Recogito in another document?
Okay, so two questions. So the first one, let me clarify. You mean searching that particular entity within your text or within the entire database?
No, within let's say you have I don't know if it's how to refer to a Recogito piece of work,
Okay.
Someone's prepared a recogito of an area or something, and you're curious to know which of these places were temples to Athena.
Yes, you can absolutely do that.
So there is.
I'm going to show you how if you want.
Okay. Yes. And the other one is, can you embed? If you prepare something, it's a part of a larger document you're preparing. Can you make it interactive? If it, in other words, if it's available digitally.
Yes. So it depends on what you want to embed. There are different levels to it. If you want to embed your text, your annotated text, there are ways to do that. If you want to embed just the annotations that you did, there are other ways to do that. If you want to embed the map that you produced, there are other ways to do that. Okay. So it depends on the level of interaction that you want to have.
But it's allowed.
But it's allowed. Yes, absolutely.
Great.
Sarah, did you have a question or point to raise? Thought I saw your hand.
Oh, yes. We were talking earlier about roads, and I wondered also about rivers, because the document I was looking at refers to rivers and also a whole country. So yeah, they being kind of larger areas, or again, a river is a sort of a line. Are those entities already in there, or is that part of the same, so like roads?
So double answer to that. Roads are specific to the time period. Right, so a road changes through time. A river, partly, but not with the same, not as fast, let's say. So it depends on what you want to represent. I can tell you rivers and seas as well are in Pleiades. There are entries for them. But what they represent, the way that they are represented is not a line, it is a representative point. And this is something that I don't like, because that's not what a river is, right? A river is a line feature. However, the same as it works for roads, there are resources, there are map layers available that have that kind of information that you can download and you can add to your map to have that kind of additional piece of information in there. Actually, one of the centers that I linked in my slides, the Ancient World Mapping Center at Chapel Hill, curates a lot of that sort of additional data. There are repositories where you can go and you can download that kind of information and you can play around with it. It's not super accurate, obviously, because it needs to, take into account the little that we know about changes in the water bodies, but it's definitely a start and it's an excellent one.
Okay, thank you.
Oh, and countries, the same thing. So Pleiades has information about countries which are represented as geometries, so big areas. You're going to see that. But it depends on the time period, right? There are fairly accurate map layers for Roman provinces, for example, very little for the rest of the time in the Mediterranean, because it's much more complicated.
I've got a question that relates, I think, to the country's question, and it goes back to events that you mentioned, being a complicated topic. So with a place name, I can understand like selecting it and saying this is a place name, but if you have a description of the Battle of Plataea, like a long narrative, do you just select the whole, 1,000 words and say this is the Battle of Plataea, or how do you do it? That's
a very good question, and the answer is it's your choice.
Okay.
Because it depends on what you're doing, right? This is the reason why I love annotation, because it depends on what your research question is. If your research question is, I just want to know where the Battle of Plataea is mentioned or named, that's one thing. If your research question is, I want to know exactly how the Battle of Plataea appears in these, 9 different works, and what kinds of things are said about the Battle of Plataea, that is a different question. In that particular case, again, we get a little bit more into the modeling sort of area rather than in the strictly tagging and annotation area, because you need to have an idea of what is it that you want to look for and how do you want to annotate it so that a stupid computer understands what you're going for and gives you the result that you want.
Great. Thank you. Janet.
Thank you. Is there a language limitation for the text that you can upload?
I love this question. Okay, the easy answer is no. You can upload text and documents in any language you want, provided that they are in textual format, so TXT format or XML format, for those of you who are familiar. But you're going to be able to do different things with them. So if your text is in English, a certain level of operations you will be able to perform automatically. So named entity recognition, for example, Recogito has a feature that does that automatically for English, and it works pretty well. So it's going to be able to recognize and classify most of the places or people or whatever for you in your document. As you can probably imagine, other languages do not have the same level of services that English has, and definitely not with the same accuracy. So for Latin, it sort of works, but it tends to be inaccurate. For Greek, doesn't work. And of course, if we go into classical Chinese or classical Arabic or Hittite or Akkadian or whatever it is, you're going to have to do a lot of work yourself. And for images, of course, the same thing. There are projects around that specifically have the aim of automatically doing this sort of work. We're definitely not there yet for historical maps.
I've got another question. It's about accessing the texts as a reader or a user who's just out there. If I'm interested in Pausanias, which Ian mentioned earlier, and I want to see all the annotations that people have made on Recogito on Pausanias, can I do that? Or do I have to go to each person's version?
For Pausanias specifically, you can regardless, because there's a project that is doing it. So they're making that information available. In general, it depends. So you cannot access to every single thing that every single person has created in Recogito for obvious reasons. One of them being copyright. So you cannot access texts that are uploaded in Recogito if they're under copyright, because they cannot be published. So there are different levels of shareability of documents in Recogito. If a particular project is annotating a text and they're interested in making it available, you're going to be able to have a link and have a look at it. If you're sharing a text with other people, you can definitely see everything that everybody is doing. There's no way to hide annotations if you're doing that as a shared project with other people. If, as we were saying before with Gorgo, I think, if you are intentionally sharing work, embedding what you have created in another resource, a research paper, a website, and so on, people are definitely going to be able to see that. So it depends on the level. The short answer is it depends on the level.
Okay, thank you. Any other questions?
Well, I have lots of questions, but we'll just continue, please. It'll
All
be
right,
easier that way.
All right, well, let's get to work.
Right.
I'll make some groups. For those of you watching, this is your chance to do this on your own, following the instructions that I told you about earlier.
Or don't,
Or don't.
have a look.
Yeah.
Explore.
Yeah. Well, I noticed the Portoriana has a lot of roads. Noticed not just the Via Appia, but a lot of roads that probably would be hard to find on the ground today.
Yes, definitely. But it doesn't matter, because it depends on whether those places, roads in this case, have been assigned coordinates or not. It doesn't matter whether they exist still or not. That's the beauty of digital space. Even if something doesn't exist, you can identify it. And you can actually map it somehow. So, and so does the itinerary as well. One of the pieces that I want to annotate with you is the VI, so the roads. And they're not lines, obviously, they are strings of places, lists of places. Okay,
so I've made some breakout rooms and I'm ready to send everyone to them. And then Chiara, I'll send you to one of them, I guess. Actually, I'll just
Okay.
include you to begin with in one of them,
Sure.
and we'll go from there. Okay, here we go. Oh, you may have to join them yourself. Oh, there you go. Automatically, everyone's leaving. Oh, sorry. I think somehow I muted everyone automatically. Please feel
Yes.
free to unmute.
So Chiara, I'm curious because in that instance, you had done all the heavy lifting for us. But let's suppose we had chosen Sarah's text. What would we do to find Mediolanum on there? How would we create that information?
So there's a couple ways to go about it. Let me try to give you a short answer. Generally, you just have to learn what works because the answer was there. We just didn't have the time to figure out what was wrong with it. I think it was just a problem of the browser at that point. If you go back, Sarah, to that document that you uploaded right now and you refresh the page, I think you're going to be totally fine. The process is exactly the same. So it doesn't change anything. I did one thing, one little trick to make things easier for you guys, which was I limited the range of gazetteers that you could use. Because otherwise, in certain instances, you get a ton of different possible matches, and that's not pleasant. And it's something that you can absolutely do. There's a tutorial about it on YouTube that you can watch.
I think the step that we missed was clicking on the pencil to do the edit.
If you want to edit, you need to click on the pencil.
I think we would have found something more if we had clicked on the pencil, perhaps.
Yeah, but it's a learning process. As you get used to it, you learn to, figure out all the different ways. And if you're passionate about it, you're gonna relearn it and forget about it a ton of times before you actually get proficient. But that's how it works. I didn't learn all of this in one day. Actually, it looked very different when I learned to use it the first time.
So how was that experience? Any more questions or comments?
It was very interesting.
Love to hear that.
Yet another thing to occupy my time with.
As long as it has to do with the ancient world.
It would be very useful especially if you're going to get proficient enough, and if you used it in your, to enhance a project you're working on.
Absolutely. It is absolutely something that you can do, and it's relatively easy to get a hand on. You just have to figure out what is it that you actually want to know.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Like
Because
any research, what are your questions? Get the questions right in the first place. I was just annotating randomly.
Well, I mean,
geez, Sarah, you know me so well.
honestly, I wish that was the case. A lot of times you sort of develop the questions as you go.
Yeah, that's right.
And that is sort of my experience as well. A lot of the texts that I work on are texts that have very limited scholarship, and I myself don't know what I'm getting myself into as I go there. So it's a learning process, and sometimes you have to go back and rethink your wrong decisions and do everything all over again. It's life, it's how life goes.
Yeah, like thinking of what tags am I going to need, and then you think, well, actually, I need to split those or subcategorize them. That sort of thing.
Right.
I can immediately see that just from the little bit I've done. Yeah.
I used the wrong tag. Oh, this place is not what I thought it was. Or there's a connection between these two that I didn't think about before. Like there's a ton of things that eventually you want to discuss, because I mean that's what this is about: challenging your own assumptions.
It could be a great travel aid if you're going to explore an ancient area. Lots of extra information in there, personalized for you.
Yeah.
Well, maybe we'll just thank you, Chiara, for all of this exciting, information and this tool. It does look really easy to use, and I'm looking forward to using it myself in the future. So thank you. And
Thank you very much.
To those of you here for being game for this very interactive on the fly situation. And thanks to all of you out there for watching.
That's great.